Good evening, and welcome to the Boston Public Library's Local History Lecture Series. As part of our program, we want to read the following statement to bring attention to the land which we use for our building and events. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement, which will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, Free to All. Tonight, in collaboration with the Partnership of Historic Bostons, we are very pleased to present a panel discussion entitled The Long Legacy, the Cost and Continuance of Indigenous Resistance. The Partnership of Historic Bostons is a public history organization committed to telling the stories of all the early New Englanders. The Long Legacy is the final event in the Partnership's 8-part series, Metacom's Resistance, retelling King Philip's War and its legacy. The series has challenged the traditional understanding of this most violent of wars, the bloodiest per capita in American history, by exploring it from an indigenous and more accurate perspective. This program is being live streamed and recorded. Marianne Zujewski, a member of the partnership, is up next for introductions.
Thank you very much, Diane. And really, I want to say welcome first to everyone here at the Boston Public Library. Can you hear me okay? Okay, wonderful, thank you. And also welcome to those that are joining us online this evening for tonight's panel, which is The Long Legacy, the Cost and Continuance of Indigenous Resistance. And I do again want to thank the Boston Public Library for hosting us and for Diane for giving us an introduction. And as Diane mentioned, if you are joining us for the first time, the Partnership for Historic Bostons is a very small nonprofit public history organization. I'm Marianne Zujewski. I'm a volunteer and board member, and I've been volunteering just for just about a year now. And we do focus on 17th century New England history. Tonight's program, as was mentioned, is the final installment of an 8-part series, Metacom's Resistance, retelling King Philip's War and its legacy. And it's to mark the 350th anniversary of this conflict, one of the deadliest in North American history. And if you've been with us for the entire series, we're truly grateful. For anyone that would like to view any of the other past events, you can visit our website, historicbostons.org, and watch all the recordings, or we have a YouTube page as well. King Philip's War was not just a 17th century conflict, but really a formative moment that established enduring systems of colonial power, shaping US policies and cultural attitudes. And yet it's often treated as a distant colonial episode rather than the formative and enduring event that it was. And so through this series, we've really sought to turn the traditional narrative on its head, confronting the history and legacy of the war with greater honesty and depth. I don't think she's here right now, but seeing as this is the final event of the series, I did just want to take a minute to recognize the Historic Boston's president, Sarah Stewart. She's great. Well, her original vision for the series really helped to create an opportunity to highlight the people, Native, non-Native historians, educators, and activists, including the people that we have here tonight, who have been and continue to correct the historical narrative of the conflict. Which brings us here tonight. So we're not here to retell the history of the war, of the conflict. We have many resources, again, like on our website. There's a list of resources of important books and articles that you can access. So again, this is really the end where we are asking the question, how do we reckon with the legacy of King Philip's War today, especially knowing what we know now? And I'm very honored to introduce our moderator and our panelists tonight. Cheryl Tony Hawley is our moderator, and our panelists, Paula Peters, Max Scott, and Kimberly Tony. And I encourage you, I'm going to just say some brief words about them, but you should read their bios on the Eventbrite page to get a full picture, and also to then go and look up all the various work that they have been doing in their areas of expertise over many years. So the moderator for tonight's panel is Cheryl Tony Hawley. She's the leader of the Hassan-Minisco Nipmuc Band and a researcher, writer, and advocate for Indigenous rights, focusing on land back initiatives, education, and language reclamation. She's a co-founder of the Nipmuc Indian Development Corporation and former director of the Hassan-Minisco Indian Museum. And she served in numerous leadership roles in her community across the Commonwealth, recipient of multiple honors, including the Mass Humanities Governor's Award. Our panelists include Paula Peters, a citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. She is a writer, independent scholar, and co-owner of the Native-owned creative agency Smoke Signals, whose work focuses on Wampanoag history, culture, and justice. Max Scott is an enrolled member of the Narragansett Indian tribe. He's a historian, educator, and author whose work focuses on Indigenous histories, memory, and futurity in the Dawnland Narragansett region. He serves as the Director of Undergraduate Studies for Native American and Indigenous Studies and visiting assistant professor at Brown University's Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And finally, Kim Tony is an enrolled member of the Hassan-Minisco Nipmuc Band. She's the inaugural coordinating curator of Native American and Indigenous collections at Brown University's John Carter Brown and John Hay libraries. Her work focuses on language and cultural reclamation, Black and Indigenous histories in the Northeast, Indigenous knowledge systems, and land back efforts. We are so very honored to have these esteemed panelists and moderator here with us, so please join me in a warm welcome to them. And one last question before, or one last point before I turn it over to Cheryl and our panelists. And we've done this at a couple of our different programs. For question and answer for the audience, Roxanne, who is our PHB board member, has index cards and pencils. So we're going to ask that you write down any questions that you want to ask our panelists and moderator for that when that portion of the program comes. So we have a little bit more efficient way of managing that process. So. Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'll hand it over to you all.
Is the mic on? Yeah. Waninkwe Wani, Natsasawa, Cheryl Tony Hawley, Sun Squire of Hassan-Minisco Nipmuc. I want to thank each of you for joining us today for this important conversation on the 350th anniversary of King Philip's War, a conflict that reshaped the Indigenous and colonial war in New England in profound, irreversible ways. In the mainstream histories, this war is overlooked and often reduced to a few footnotes or treated as a tragic misunderstanding. But for the Native nations of New England, including the Narragansett, Wampanoag, Nipmuc, Stockbridge, Munsee, and Wabanaki peoples, King Philip's War was a defining rupture. It was not simply a war. It was an organized attempt to dismantle Indigenous sovereignty, landholding, kinship networks, and spiritual life. By the time the war ended in 1676, tens of thousands of acres had been seized. Entire villages had been burned to ash. Thousands of Native people had been killed, sold into slavery, or forcibly displaced. Some communities were shattered forever. Others, against all odds, survived by adapting, remembering, resisting. What followed was a new era, one in which English colonists no longer feared unified native resistance. The war cleared a path for the expansion of English settlement with brutal efficiency. It marked a turning point from contested ground to colonial dominion. What was once a shared and negotiated landscape became territory to claim and divide. But that's not the end of the story. We did not vanish. We adapted. We carried forward memory, language, ceremony, governance, often in the face of laws and policies designed to extinguish them. The war's aftermath left deep scars, but it also left seeds of endurance. This evening, we are privileged to hear from descendants of the very peoples who endured that war and who carry forward the legacy of their ancestors, not as relics, but as living cultures. And as we reflect on this 350th anniversary, let us not just listen for history, but for guidance. These stories are not only about the past, they're about survival, about continuity, and about the future Indigenous people continue to shape on this land. Tabatni Kadabadamish. So, I am the moderator, and you see we have Paula Peters, Max Scott, Kim Toney, and we're going to start off with 3 questions that the Partnership of Historic Bostons would like us to answer. And those questions are, when you hear the phrase, the long legacy of King Philip's War, what comes to mind first? The program description notes that the war laid foundations for continued colonial expansion and even the American Revolution. How should audiences understand those connections? And the third question is, how do language revitalization, land stewardship, education, public history, and art function as acts of continuance and resistance? And we hope that you'll talk about some projects as well. So, who would like to go first?
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Monino Kishkawatuank, it's good to be here with you. As you heard, I am Kim Toney. You would have also heard that I'm Nipmuc, I'm a mom, I'm also a librarian, a historian. I find myself doing lately a lot of sort of public history scholarship. And my work really focuses on Indigenous histories of New England, and especially on the legacies of colonialism and Indigenous continuance in the Northeast. And so for me, a lot of the work that I do, a lot of the research that I do, a lot of the, research instruction that I do at the library asks what it means to sort of recover Indigenous presence in places and in archives that have really tried to erase us or silence those histories. Especially interested in how we bring our ancestors and communities back into public memory, not as like relics of the past or through some like romanticized ideal of what indigeneity is, but as living people whose histories and relationships continue into the present. So when I hear a phrase like the long legacy of King Philip's War, I really think first about the fact that Indigenous people in New England are still living within and sort of underneath structures that were intensified and normalized during and after the war. So these things Cheryl mentioned, like land dispossession, forced removal off of those lands, enslavement, surveillance, detribalization, and the fragmentation of Native communities and kinship networks, things that we're still sort of working to recover in our communities today. I think about places like Deer Island in Boston Harbor that I'll maybe talk a little bit more about later, where Native people were removed or confined during the war under really devastating conditions, and how those histories really remain largely absent from public memory, even in the places they occurred, even here in Boston. I think about how many people in New England are taught to think of Native people only in the past tense, despite the fact that our communities adapted, we reorganized, we persisted, again, despite the centuries of pressure designed to eradicate us. So I think about all those things, but I also think about continuance, because the legacy is not just about violence. It's also about survival. It's about resistance, adaptation, and a responsibility to future generations and this sort of dream of Indigenous futures. So for me, this idea of continuance too is really relational. It lives in those things like language revitalization, in stewardship, in ceremony, in community gatherings, in art, in education, in this public history work, in the interventions that I think maybe all of us on this panel do, in curriculum development, or the ways we teach Indigenous history in Massachusetts and Rhode Island specifically. And just thinking about all the ways that we continue to sort of carry forward our traditions. And these are not just like symbolic acts. They're ways that we, or I'll speak for myself, like I am able to reaffirm and reaffirm the relationships that colonial systems that we still sort of live under have tried for a really long time to sever. Again, those like relationships to land, ancestors, a relationship to modernity, to the future, and to one another. And as Cheryl mentioned too, the war fundamentally reshaped power in New England. It accelerated land dispossession. It opened enormous amounts of Indigenous land to colonial settlement and speculation. I think important to note that sort of a reward for settlers for participating in the war was not like silver or money. It was land. If you fought in the war, you were awarded land for the most part all over Mass Bay Colony into Maine. And I think also that the violence enacted and the forms of dispossession enacted in the 1670s helped to really sort of normalize frameworks and worldviews that Indigenous people were treated not necessarily or not as sovereign nations, but as like obstacles to expansion. So it's really solidifying this like colonial idea that instead of people being sovereign and distinct in their like cultures and life ways, that they're more like these obstacles to be removed from the path to, I guess, what is American nationhood that's developing at this time, like sort of leading up to the Revolutionary War. So, yeah, and I think in speaking about kind of my own work and projects, I will also hopefully talk more a little bit later about my project Their Marks, which I do write about. I wrote a blog post about, and you can find on the website of the Partnership for Historic Bostons. But for that project, I'm really interested in connecting and figuring out the ways that archival materials specifically can be reread through Indigenous frameworks and returned to community memory in ways that challenge these colonial narratives that were really fed over time. As someone who went to school and learned about Indigenous history in Massachusetts, I didn't see myself or people like me reflected in those stories, right? So I'm thinking about how to call those stories back into the conversation. And I want anyone who engages with Their Marks to really understand that our ancestors were not like acted upon by history. They were not passive. They were not having sort of passive forms of engagement in history, but they were diplomats and strategists and intellectuals, artists, survivors. And I think public history forums like this one can become a way that we not only sort of talk about legacy, and I think maybe in the time where we're like commemorating the 350th anniversary of King Philip's War, sometimes you're sort of pushed to think about the violence of war, but I think when we think about legacy, we have to think not only about the violence, but the continuance and the survival. And so in these spaces too, we can think about legacy in terms of resistance when we're here talking about and kind of refusing like sanitized narratives, instead asking institutions, libraries, museums, and communities to confront like ongoing realities related to settler colonialism, rather than treating Indigenous history as something confined to the distant past. So I think the idea of long legacy is calling us to think about the way that the war, the before, during, and the after are really not that far away from how we're living and connecting together today. So I'm going to leave it there, and we'll be happy to talk a little bit more based on the questions we get later.
All right, well, thank you. Sorry. Cheryl and Historic Bostons and the Boston Public Library and all of you for being here. This is actually a pretty good segue into what I'll be talking about just at the beginning here, because I'm going to kind of lead you on an exercise where we kind of think about some of these legacies and what they mean and how they materialize in our world today. So, you might not know, because you don't know, but I really like to watch superhero movies. Like the Marvel and DC type movies, right? I think there's one coming out this summer. It's called Supergirl. I'll be there. But I think the real draw of these movies for me is that I can consume an entire bucket of popcorn by myself, and it is socially acceptable. So when you watch these movies, you always opine about what your superpower would be. Would you want something like super strength, the ability to fly, or perhaps be able to control the weather? But I never wonder what my superpower would be, because I already know what it is. I already have it, and it is on full display today. And I know what you're thinking, super strength, right? I know that. But no, that's not it. My superpower is surrounding myself with people who will make me look good. So when I heard that Cheryl, Paula, and Kim were on this panel, I said, it's time for me to go and be a superhero. So I realized that I only have 5 minutes to contextualize the long legacy of the War of New England, or what some call King Philip's War. And I will try to do my best, but as a historian, brevity is my kryptonite. We were initially asked about what comes to mind when you hear the phrase, the long legacy of King Philip's War. What first comes to mind for me is that by referring to the conflict as King Philip's War, we are complicit in the normalization and continuation of the subtle colonial logics that both animated and continue to define the struggle. For example, right now, in 2026, the city of Providence continues to use as its official seal an image that rationalizes and justifies subtler colonialism. The image not only celebrates the arrival of Roger Williams to Moshassuck, but also the violence, enslavement, genocide, and dispossession that turned Moshassuck into Providence, the Narragansett country into Rhode Island, and the Dawnland into New England. This is the legacy with which we must contend. But to do this, we must be willing to interrogate the past. Now, I have a book coming out next year that will do this in about 100,000 words, but don't worry, they only give me 5 minutes. So to speed this along, I will use 2 visual aids. One of the images you see on the screen here is the 1630 Massachusetts Bay Colonial Seal. The seal is emblematic of the imagery that the newcomers brought with them when they first arrived in the Dawnland. You see, the separatists had come as evangelicals with a more pure, hence Puritan, message that would surely be embraced by a ready, eager, and thankful populace that would happily give up their lifeways, lands, and if need be, lives in exchange for the Jesus that the Puritans had promised. Surprising to no one, except perhaps the Pilgrims themselves, the natives, for the most part, refused the exchange. A few missionaries did find a modicum of success establishing what were known as praying towns, but what was being asked of natives was an almost antithetical to the ways in which they had lived and how they had ordered their societies. The quote-unquote purer form of Christianity transported across the Atlantic was rooted in patriarchy and individualism, with male patriarchs as the heads of their individual households. This must have appeared as alien to Dawnland communities who were matrilineal, kinship-based, and communal, as universal health care, gun control, or gender equality appear today to some very vocal segments of the American populace. The bottom line is that the imaginary encapsulated in the seal was not a reality, and that this is what led to conflict. The refusal of Native peoples to wholly adopt the life ways and beliefs of the newcomers did not inspire reflection or introspection among the newly arrived, but instead resentment and condemnation. To wrest the land from a people now deemed as savages and heathens, the newcomers needed to prosecute extreme acts of violence, including the wholesale slaughter of non-combatants, women, children, and elderly men in places known today as Mystic, Connecticut, Charlestown, Rhode Island, and Deerfield, Massachusetts. And to do so, the distinct and individualistic colonies needed to unite, and they did, forming the United Colonies, the first intercolonial alliance of Englishmen anywhere in the world. When Benjamin Franklin penned his famous Join or Die cartoon in 1754, he was not trying to convince the leaders of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island to unite because they already had, a century earlier, in an effort to create their New England. Franklin was telling audiences in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas that they needed to heed and follow the New England's lead if they hoped to create a new nation out of someone else's land. It is in this way, like the seal of the city of Providence, celebrations of America's 250th, without a deeper reflection about the processes that embedded the establishment and continued existence of this nation, continues the furtherance of settler colonial logic that seeks to explain and justify inequitable outcomes by erasing and seeking to undermine the continued existence of indigenous communities. Today, by design, the Narragansett people are at the bottom of every socioeconomic measure in Rhode Island, and this, more than anything else, constitutes the long legacy of the War for New England. Thank you.
Does this work? Oh, it does. Manikisak. Netasui Songwaben, Nutamas Masapiak. I'm greeting you in my traditional language. I am Paula Peters. I'm a citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, and in my tradition, I am called Songwaben. I am very grateful to be sitting next to Superman because I could not open this bottle of water until Mac helped me. He really is a Superman. But on a more serious note, when you consider the legacy of Metacom's rebellion, which is how we like to refer to it, consider the Wampanoag, the Nipmuc, the Massachusetts, the Narragansett, the Pequot, as the most genocidally resilient people on Turtle Island. Today, we are the living legacy to those ancestors who were the front line of first contact. We have endured despite hundreds of years of diseases, oppression, war, and still live on the land occupied by our people for more than 12,000 years. Metacom, who was the son of the Massasoit Usamiquin, who died in 1661, inherited leadership of a fractured Wampanoag nation and their allies a year later when his older brother, Wamsuta, died suspiciously after a summit with the colonists. Metacom's lived experience was one of dispossession, tyranny, and injustice over decades of colonizers annexing territory, leveraging colonial law with trickery, liquor, religion, and betrayal. The account of the Deputy Governor, John Easton of Rhode Island, who attempted to broker peace with Metacom in the days just prior to the rebellion, reveals a lot about where the Wampanoag stood just 50 years after his father, Usamequin, had agreed to a treaty of mutual existence, really, with the colonists. But Metacom detailed the grievances of the Wampanoag and their allies to Easton as follows. He told Easton that things were very different at the beginning. They, the Wampanoag, had been the first in doing good to the English, and the English the first in doing wrong. When the English first came, Usamequin was a great man, and they were the English like little children. Usamequin constrained other Indians from wrongdoing the English and gave them corn and showed them how to plant and was free to do for them any good. And he had let them have 100 times more of the land than now Metacom had for his own people. Metacom then spoke of his brother. When Wamsuta was the king, which only lasted less than a year, he came miserably to die by being forced to the English court, and as we judge, was then poisoned. When the land was sold to the English, they would say it was more than what we agreed to. The English gave Indians liquor to take advantage of them, and they would take more than what they were deserving. Magistrates enforced laws severely and unjustly against the Wampanoag, and not so against the colonists. And lastly, Metacom's men had been unjustly convicted and hanged in the murder of John Sassaman. He was an Indian informer to the English and a traitor. Easton told Metacom war was the wrong solution, and he begged him to consider another way. The quarrel might rightly be decided in the best way, not as dogs decide their quarrels, but by arbitration, which shows that he really wasn't listening to Metacom at all. Metacom told him his people had experienced arbitration and that it had not gone well. He said, "Many miles square of land has been taken from them, for English would have English arbitrators in their courts. In the English court, the Wampanoag were made to disarm themselves, unlike the English, and then their weapons were confiscated unless they paid an unreasonable bounty for them." When Easton and Metacom parted company, there was no hope of a resolution, and while it did not end in the favor of Metacom, we are still here. We are that legacy of the rebellion, and we continue to maintain our place in our ancestral homeland.
Thank you. Thank you all for those insightful remarks. I have some questions for you as well, one for each of you. And then after this portion, we're going to take questions from the audience. So my first question is for Bruce Banner. Following the devastation of the Great Swamp Massacre, the Narragansett people endured state-level detribalization and forced invisibility. How has your community managed to transform that post-war silence into resistance, and what aspects of your present-day cultural and political life do you trace directly to your ancestors' response to the war's immediate aftermath?
Well, thank you, Cheryl. And thank you for giving me a heads up about this question because it's a really detailed and deep question. So last weekend, we had our Elders Day. And during Elders Day, what happens is it's an all-day event, and it starts at 9 a.m. And at 9 a.m., there's a fire on our traditional homelands where our churches and our power grounds are. And at that fire, that's the fire about the past and the elders. And any elder can talk and remember, and that's what happens, right? People start talking about family memories and histories, and this history comes up, right? People talk about the War for New England and the Great Swamp Massacre and all of that, and it becomes part of who we are, right? And everything that's transpired since then. So this is a lived history, right? There's this quote that I love using from James Baldwin that says, history is not merely or principally about the past, right? It's about the present. It shapes who we are. And this is embodied during that ceremony. We're remembering, we're talking about it. But also talking about who we are and how we are connected to each other, and whose families and whose aunties and whose uncles and all of that. The next fire that we have is the fire for the present, right? And then pretty much anybody can talk at that one. And we're talking about a lot of the, who we are, what our connections are, things that are happening today for our community, challenges that we have today, but also celebrating us as a group, right? So doing things like the round dance and holding hands and knowing that these are your people. We have a lunch, and then later we have our final fire, which is the fire about the future. And we have a lot of the children will do dances, right? And we'll have opportunities to talk and all of that. But essentially what's happening in that day is what has sustained the community for, time out of mind, right? The community itself, coming together, being together, reaffirming what makes us a community, our shared experiences, reaffirming what makes us a community, our ceremonies and things that we value, right? Talking about our connections, who is lighting the fire, what dances are we doing, all of those things that kind of tie us together. Also builds resiliency, right? And also creates this community in which we can rely on, and which we've had to rely on for hundreds of years as we dealt with the pressures and challenges of settler colonialism. So that's would be my answer to that type of question, like how what came out of this war, and how did we use that past to continue to inform our present, is by just taking stock and taking inspiration from the survivance, like Kim was talking about, of our community, and remembering it for these hundreds of years.
Thank you, Mac. My next question is for Kim. King Philip's War hit the Nipmuc extremely hard. Most Nipmuc bands joined the war against the colonists, and in retaliation, many of our ancestors were killed, enslaved, or driven from their homelands. Yet the Nipmuc story has often been marginalized or forgotten in popular histories of the war. Looking back after 350 years, what do you feel is the most misunderstood or overlooked about the Nipmuc people's experience in King Philip's War, and how does that ongoing struggle for visibility and recognition impact our community today? In confronting this history, what steps do you see as critical for healing historical trauma and ensuring that our people's identity and rights are respected moving forward?
I have a lot of thoughts to try to answer this question. Thank you for that, Charlotte. It gives a really, it's nice to have the opportunity to articulate what I think are things that are misunderstood or misrepresented about Nipmuc history, to be able to sort of articulate that in this space. And I guess one thing that I think, it's hard to pick one thing. You're going to hear more than one thing from me, but that is misunderstood is that Nipmuc people our histories, our engagements in the conflict were not peripheral to the war for the Dawnland or King Philip's War, right? Our communities were central to the conflict. And I pulled up this map just to give a sense of Nipmuc homelands because we were central to the conflict geographically, but also politically, also militarily. Our ancestors were making difficult decisions in the face of escalating colonial violence and doing so in connection with and side by side with Narragansett and Wampanoag relations. Our Nipmuc relatives appeared across almost every theater of the war, for lack of a better term. And I know their names and parts of their histories because they're written about in primary documents that I research and I'm able to connect to in the archive. Mattawamp, Matunis, Waban, Wawasser James Printer, Andrew Pittamy, Black James, Uppachatic. These folks, I don't know if any of you have ever heard those names before or have seen them appear as more than just street names or something across the landscape, but these were people who facilitated alliances, fought, and tried to survive in different ways. Their names and the circumstances of their lives are written about in letters and correspondences made between colonial writers. Their names are included in printed histories of the war, written immediately following the war and into the early 17th and 18th, into the early 18th century. And I think when I think about what is misunderstood, even in sort of offering the names of those people, I think gives us maybe a chance to be reflective about historiography, about how history is told and by whom. I think one of the ongoing challenges for me as a Nipmuc librarian, as a Nipmuc person, maybe for other people across communities, especially in the Northeast, is that so much of what people think they know about our histories has been mediated through how people engage with colonial archives. Our ancestors appear in those records, as I said, but often they're only talked about in the ways that they appear in like moments of crisis, right? So like they're documented as they appear during war, or as they appear on land transaction documents, or as they appear in their Christian conversion narratives, as they appear as criminals who are called before the colonial court, as they are confined or poisoned, maybe. And I encounter ancestors often in secondary sources in those moments, right? I think about when was the first time I learned about who John Sassaman was when I'm reading in a secondary source about when his body was found and sort of the beginnings of King Philip's War. And even then, right, those histories of those people and their lives are written about by colonists, settlers who misunderstood them. I think Max started by talking about this, or who feared them or had political reasons to distort Native actions and identities. And so part of what I've tried to do through projects like Their Marks in my explorations of early 17th century land transactions, or what are often called Indian deeds or Indian petitions, is to engage archival materials differently. So not simply as colonial records of like criminalization or land dispossession, but as places where Indigenous presence, relationships, and agency can still be traced and still be recovered. For those who may be unfamiliar, Their Marks is a project that's connected to archives, clearly, and it centers the pictographic signature marks left by Indigenous leaders and community members across 17th and 18th century documents from the native Northeast. I focus primarily on land deeds, on petitions, related legal records. There are a lot of court documents and things, and as I mentioned, many categorized in library catalogs as Indian deeds or Indian petitions. The project brings sustained attention to the marks themselves as deliberate, meaningful forms of Indigenous presence and self-representation within documents that functioned as tools of settler dispossession. And central to the project and how I approach it is sort of an insistence that pictographic marks, like the sort of P that we've been seeing in the publication materials for this event, mark made by Metacom or Philip himself, is that the marks are not evidence of like absence or deficiency or illiteracy. Rather, they're chosen forms of representation that reflect Indigenous ways of knowing, relationships to community, land, and more than human relatives. They are representations in so far as their appearance on the page that help us understand strategies of engagement within profoundly unequal power dynamics, sort of a nod to what Paula was talking about. The project also foregrounds Algonquian language place names that appear in these documents because settlers were really intent on mapping out exactly what land they were getting in exactly what space and nearby what stream and what pond and what hill. It's important to recover those place names as they appear in the 17th century documents because almost immediately, in years later, they're replaced or erased through colonial forms of renaming. And so for me, the project treats language and land as sort of inseparable. And what I've come to understand after over 15 years of working as a librarian is that colonial period archives really flatten Indigenous people and lend themselves to misunderstandings or misinterpretations because often Native people are categorized as praying Indians or allies or captives, but when you start following individual people and kinship networks through records and also through oral history, through connection to community and knowledge keepers, you see lives that were really much more complex than categories allow, especially like I spend my professional life in a system that has libraries have a lot of particular logics and hierarchies around how things are categorized, where you find something on the shelf, right, that's predicated on a particular worldview that's not necessarily one that includes Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And so Cheryl, you mentioned, part of your question was about like how I understand or pursue forms of like visibility and recognition. And I think it's not only about these forms of inclusion or like connecting back or calling folks to sort of re-engage with the archive. I think that's important. But it's also connected to like fundamentally trying to reshape how history is told and who has the authority to interpret it. So our communities are not just like subjects of history, we are ourselves historians, interpreters, knowledge keepers, artists, theorists of our own experience. And I feel like a lot of that has kind of been left out. But it's changing. And it's interesting to think like when I'm in the archive and finding deeds, I had a really profound experience that I've written about on the Their Marks Instagram page about engaging with this deed that you see on the screen for the first time. Like these moments of encounter, I think also call me to think about the fact that many of the people whose names appear on these documents probably in the time that they're seeing relatives die or communities sort of be decimated for all sorts of reasons. I wonder if they would have imagined like 350 years later, we would be here speaking their names into these rooms and carrying these histories forward. It's a really profound thing, I think, to think about. And we're still sort of here defending relationships to our homelands too, which is really important. And I think specifically, I guess here's another thought about misinformation or misrepresentation or visibility, I guess. I talked a little bit about Deer Island and I included, some pictures here from a visit a couple years ago that I made to Deer Island with other folks. But during the war in the winter of 1675 to 76, hundreds of Native people, including many Nipmucs, were forcibly confined on Deer Island in Boston Harbor under devastating winter conditions. It was actually an especially cold winter. And Deer Island had been almost fully deforested at that time, so there wasn't really a lot of shelter. There was not appropriate clothing. There was not food sent with people who were basically brought to Deer Island in the middle of the harbor and left there for the winter. Hundreds of people died. Yet for generations, I didn't grow up being taught the history of that internment at Deer Island. It was largely absent from public memory. Most people who visit Deer Island today, which it's like a waste processing center there, you would only encounter, there is a plaque there, but there's little interpretation there to understand sort of the scale of the suffering and the loss connected to that place. I think it's important to understand that Indigenous relationships to those histories in particular are in some ways about mourning, but not only about mourning, and in some ways about misunderstanding or misinformation, but not wholly about that. When I think about Deer Island, I think about responsibility, about remembrance, and again, this word continuance. For many of us in our community, honoring our ancestors means actively carrying their stories forward and maintaining relationships with those places and with the people who came before us. And one of the most powerful examples to me of this has been commemorative ceremonies that happen just about every year in recent memory, where not only Nipmuc people, but Wampanoag people and other Native participants as well have symbolically brought our ancestors home from Deer Island by paddling them back to the shore. Those acts are really meaningful because they reaffirm that our ancestors were not forgotten even when public history tried to erase them. They remind us that these are not distant historical events again, but they remain part of living community memory. So that to me is really about visibility and continuance. And I think also places like Deer Island are not just historical sites. They're not just waste treatment spaces. There are places that are connected to ancestors, to memory, to ceremony, to grief, but also to survival. Protecting and maintaining Indigenous relationships to those places matters a lot. And across the Northeast, there are other ways, I think, across all of our traditional homelands, Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Nipmuc people continue to advocate for the protection of sacred and cultural spaces, for repatriation. We do language reclamation, ecological stewardship, forms of land return or co-stewardship that recognize Native people as ongoing caretakers. So thinking about the ways that like violence did not end when the war ended, Native people sort of, I guess I'm just coming back to this like long legacy idea. And the third part of your question was about healing. And I think healing requires maybe more than just the plaque at Deer Island, right? It requires sustained relationships, truthful education, protection of those sacred and cultural sites, support for Indigenous language and cultural revitalization, recognition that Native nations are living political communities with ongoing rights and responsibilities. For Nipmuc people, I hope, continuance has always depended on maintaining those relationships, not just to community and kin and our human and more than human relatives, but also to memory. And especially in the face of like the systems that we live under that are designed to kind of, have been designed to fragment and disrupt those relationships. And I think part of healing and continuance involves Indigenous people reclaiming greater authority over how our histories are told, interpreted, and shared. For a long time, Native histories, including the history of this war, were filtered. I talked about how I sort of engage information in the archives with the understanding that it's presented to me in ways that are filtered primarily through the logics of archives and libraries, but also the biases, conscious and unconscious, of the people, often non-Native voices, who are telling those stories, often without meaningful engagement with the descendant communities whose histories are being discussed. which I think has real consequences. It shapes what gets remembered, what gets erased, whose humanity is centered in those historical narratives. And so one thing, I guess I'll do my librarian thing, is that I always encourage audiences to seek out and support Native authors, artists also, historians, language workers, community knowledge keepers, artists like Paula Peters, authors like Paula Peters. And that's not only when you want to learn about Indigenous history, but when you're thinking about Indigenous futures, right? We're all sitting here sort of imagining futures through our writing, through the art that we make, through our connections to community, through the land that we care for. And there really is a rich body of work being produced by Native scholars and communities that speaks from lived relationships to those histories and those homelands. So for me, that's kind of what continuance looks like. Having people sort of, Indigenous people here, like actively shaping those conversations in ourselves. And I think that's tied very closely to this idea of like how we can support each other in healing in ways that our community might call you in and ask you to show up for us. And then there are other ways that we, I think, pursue healing in our community through like elder days and other ways that we sort of come together in our own spaces to be medicine for each other.
Thank you, Kim. I also want to let everyone know that this Saturday is the 2026 Deer Island Sacred Paddle Run and Flotilla. So if you're out on Boston Harbor, if you're walking along the Charles, please be sure to cheer us on. So the next question is for Paula Peters. And so I wrote this question thinking about how much Mashpee has taken hits politically in the state that benefit all of us. So my question to you, Paula, is in the immediate aftermath of King Philip's War, Mashpee became a rare sanctuary for Wampanoag survivors. But over time, that sanctuary was threatened by creeping colonial governance and land loss. How do you see the legacy of that post-war containment, both as refuge and constraint, playing out in Mashpee's modern political and cultural struggles, especially around land and sovereignty?
Thank you, Cheryl. I do love this question because you're giving me an opportunity, and I took it very seriously. I said, now I have an opportunity to explain how Mashpee became who we are. And I sort of went around it the long way, but bear with me, everybody. So as we reflect on the 300th anniversary of Metacom's rebellion, ironically it occurs as the nation celebrates 250 years of independence. But this correlation of anniversaries was not lost on us 50 years ago. In 1976, during the bicentennial, when the Mashpee Wampanoag filed a precedent-setting legal claim for the return of ancestral lands promised to us forever. What we have discovered is that in a colonized world, forever has an end date. In the 17th century, the village of Masipi was preyed upon, quite literally, by colonial missionaries who sought to convert the Wampanoag. In 1665, the village of Masipi was established, or I should say reestablished, as a praying Indian town where many Wampanoag took cover from colonial aggression under a cloak of Christianity. We certainly didn't need their religion. Had the English bothered to look for it, native spirituality was everywhere. It centered on the tributes of the earth and the wonder of other worlds, honoring the sun, the moon, the four directions, as well as animals and birds. No chapel was necessary, since ceremonies were held wherever and as often as the occasion called for, without an assigned place or day of the week. It required only a circle where each one was individually unique, but still a part of the whole. To take refuge from the tyranny of the colonists, many native people relocated to praying Indian towns where they were forced to live in colonial-style homes, keep domestic animals, plant in rows, and worship like white men, as well as pledge allegiance to the crown. any traditional ways and ceremony had to be conducted in secrecy. So, as they were being dispossessed of their lands, they were forced to shed or hide the very sacred customs and traditions that made them Wampanoag. During Metacom's rebellion, tens of thousands of colonists and the Wampanoag and their allies were killed in what is still considered perhaps the bloodiest battle that ever was fought on American soil. Metacom was murdered defending his people and his territory to his very last breath. And any surviving Wampanoag that were deemed a threat were either executed or sold into slavery. Those who escaped that horrible injustice were only safe to remain in praying Indian towns like Masipi, which later became known as Mashpee. It became the largest of the praying Indian towns located on Cape Cod land that stretched from Cape Cod Bay to Nantucket Sound. It had a deed that promised the land to, they called us then, the South Sea Indians, and I quote, the deed said, forever. So not to be given, sold, or alienated from them by anyone without all of their consents thereunto. This is what it meant to be colonized for the first time. Despite this oppressive colonial mandate, for many years, the Wampanoag of Mashpee maintained considerable autonomy, albeit subject to the laws of the General Court and under the guidance of white missionaries and overseers. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, the Mashpee filed many disputes in colonial court to the King of England and ultimately to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to maintain this autonomy. In 1746, a law was established to assign guardians to each Indian plantation as praying Indian towns had come to be known. The guardians had the power to take into their hands the said Indians' lands and allot the several Indians of the several plantations such parts of the lands and meadows as shall be sufficient for their particular improvement. It also allowed for the guardians to lease any land that they deemed surplus to neighboring settlers. The intent being to use the money to support the Indians, but the overseers were abusing that power. Are we surprised about that? So the Mashpee Wampanoag challenged the law and protested to the General Court of Massachusetts, and I quote from their grievance. We poor Indians entreat the great court at Boston to remove those gentlemen from being our guardians, for we are more hurt since they have intermeddled about our lands and meadows, and we are now destitute. We humbly beseech our honorable rulers to take care of us, that they may not have the power to sell our land. Ignored by the General Court, the Mashpee Indians petitioned again in 1753, claiming the overseers did not, in fact, oversee anything as they lived far away, and when they did come to meet with the Indians, they did so at a tavern where there was, quote, too much liquor, and some of them were abused by the Englishmen. But the General Court continued to ignore the complaints, and in 1760, the Mashpee Indians sent a representative, Reuben Cognahew, to petition to King George in England. After a 3-year investigation in 1763, the king ordered colonial practices and policies be changed and for the Indians to be incorporated as a self-governing district. It was the first time that Mashpee was organized in some regards as a town with elected overseers and a select board, not exclusively, but dominated by Wampanoag citizens of Mashpee. Despite the grace that was granted by the king, Mashpee Wampanoag men took up arms against England in the Revolutionary War with a devastating result. More than half of the women of Mashpee were widowed, and with young men being sent into the whaling trade, the depopulation of adult males resulted in many women becoming indigent. By 1788, living conditions in Mashpee had deteriorated to such a degree that the King's Act of 1763 was repealed to establish more oversight, and new guardians were appointed. The added oversight did not stop trespassers from swindling Indians out of property rights, and it may have actually increased it. Squatters were being allowed to settle within the boundaries of the plantation, and unscrupulous overseers continued to take advantage of their charges by leasing rights to trees and meadows to people outside of the tribe. It's important to consider that at this time, most of Cape Cod had been clear-cut to support the settlers' need for lumber to build their homes and to heat their homes. But in Mashpee, where 60% of the families still lived in Wetus, and they managed their forests, their water, and wildlife as relatives, trees were in abundance. It was like the Middle East of the New World in terms of fuel production. Early in the 19th century, the Mashpee Wampanoag continued to experience conflict with overseers and filed disputes that were regularly ignored. They were assigned a new pastor, a Reverend Phineas Fish, to minister to the Mashpees at a meeting house that was built for tribal worship, but Fish established a very unwelcoming environment, leaving the Wampanoag to worship outdoors. Fish also leased tribal lands to neighboring villagers who pillaged the trees from Mashpee and didn't compensate the tribe one dime. I imagine Fish probably got some money. A Wampanoag preacher, Blind Joe Amos, preached scripture from memory to the tribe under a great oak tree on Santuit Pond. He was joined in pastoral duties by a Pequot minister and activist, William Apis, who helped the tribe form its own leadership and stand their ground. In 1634, they sent a resolution signed by 102 members of the tribe to the governor and legislature outlining the following demands. Number one, they would govern themselves. Number two, no white men would be allowed to come into the plantation to harvest wood, hay, or anything without permission. And number three, after the next 1st of July, July 1, 1834, the order would be enforced by physically removing any violator. As a first act of defiance, the newly formed tribe leadership removed Reverend Phineas Fish from the meeting house. When he refused to go as directed, they picked him up and bodily delivered him outside. That act was followed by what would become known as the Woodlot Riot. On July 1, the white men arrived, loading their wagons with lumber, but were stopped by a militia of Wampanoag men armed with clubs. They disrupted the taking of wood by physically dumping the wagons and creating a disturbance. You might say they had their own little Strait of Hormuz. Despite that they were defending the right to their own property, 3 leaders of the revolt, including Apis, were arrested. None of the white men were charged. Against the wishes of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, in 1870, a law was established to abolish the plantation as an Indian district and make Mashpee a town. Tribal leaders were vocal in their opposition to such an act, as it would make tribal members citizens and landowners vulnerable to having their land taken from them. The new law did exactly what the white neighbors had hoped. With no education or understanding of the responsibility of land ownership, taxes, mortgaging, and the like, the Mashpee Wampanoag dispossession of land began almost immediately and continued through the next 100 years. The Mashpee Wampanoag continued to govern themselves through town leadership, and despite hundreds of years of oppression, experienced a cultural revival, hosting powwows on their lands as early as 1924. But at the same time, the land was being lost to tax taking, mortgage foreclosures, and Depression-era sales. By 1970, the tribe began to see outside influences moving in and overtaking the town. Town leadership included seats on the board of selectmen and governing committees, had been exclusively held by members of the tribe, but were now held by white men who were bent on development. In response, the Mashpee Wampanoag established a tribal council in 1972 to represent the interests of the tribe. That made the newcomers nervous. During the summer of 1976, as the nation was celebrating the bicentennial of their independence, a group of tribal men who had been drumming and singing on the pond as part of a cultural gathering were brutally arrested for disturbing the peace. The Mashpee Nine would later be exonerated, but not without a months-long trial that exposed law enforcement for their overreach. This was our second colonization. Later that summer, the Mashpee Wampanoag filed a land claim for the return of all ancestral lands promised to them forever and protected by an 1870 law called the Non-Intercourse Act that forbid the transfer of Indian land without the express consent of the federal government. That was every acre of land ever sold in Mashpee. The land claim itself was never actually heard. The town's response was to question the status of Mashpee as a tribe. And in 1978, Judge Walter Skinner, a white judge, presided over a case, and an all-white jury ruled in favor of the town. But the tribe did not stop seeking acknowledgement, and we would endure a federal recognition process that was the most expensive and cumbersome legal litmus test any group of people has ever faced. Only after accepting help from gaming investors to pay for lawyers and lobbyists was our petition moved through the process. And still, it took 30 years to finally correct Judge Skinner's incredible injustice when the Department of the Interior federally acknowledged the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe in 2007, noting that ours was the strongest petition that they had ever reviewed. Since then, the battles continue, and we have faced legal challenges to our trust lands that blocked economic development initiatives, including a gaming facility, but we ultimately prevailed. The tribe's first light casino opened in Taunton last year and is looking forward to another summer concert series. We are a thriving tribe of more than 3,000 citizens with a governing body that includes our traditional chief and medicine man in legislating law, tribal law and policy on our ancestral homelands. In Mashpee, we have a housing development and a government and community center providing jobs and services to our tribal citizens, including a tribal school where the Wampanoag language is taught, youth programs, an elder center with twice-weekly luncheons, a natural resource protection department, cultural and historic preservation, an Indian health service clinic, law enforcement, and a tribal court. In July, we're going to host our 104th annual powwow on our tribal lands. Yes, we remain that sovereign, autonomous body that Metacom died for, that Reuben Conague petitioned the King of England for, that William Apis and the Mashpee Nine went to jail for. So that legacy to me is that we are still here.
Thank you, Paula. So we have time for one more individual question, and this is for Bruce Banner again. The Narragansett tribe suffered immense loss during King Philip's War, yet your community endured by holding on to traditions and eventually reclaiming land and recognition. How has the memory of that trauma and the story of survival shaped the Narragansett people's identity and community life today? And in what ways are the Narragansett looking forward to the future to ensure the continuity of your culture and sovereignty 350 years after the war?
Thank you, Cheryl. And so as you can see, I wasn't lying. My superpower is in full display. You might not realize this, and this is not true of myself, but Narragansett people are not known for their humility and modesty. And I think this comes from the fact that the Narragansett, if you know anything about this history, were the unmitigated hegemons of this region. This is not a joke. This is real. No, all right. Anyway, but so with that said, you know, this is what I research and study, and what I was most, I guess, surprised about in all of my research that I've done about my community is just how out in the forefront people have been the entire time, right? From day one to today. You might not know this either, but the relationship between the Narragansett and the state of Rhode Island is one of the most challenged that exist in anywhere in government-to-government relationship in America. And there's an event that just passed a couple of months ago with part of this 350th anniversary, which is, and this is an event that we don't talk about a lot in Rhode Island or anywhere, and that is the burning of Providence, right? There's this mythology about, and you can see it on that, the Providence seal, about this good relationship between the newcomers and the natives. So that event where Providence is burned down, including Roger Williams' home, becomes a problem, becomes a challenge. But it also is evidence of the way in which the obstinance and the survivance and all of that has been part of the experience for Narragansett people forever, right? So if we move forward in history, we will see the Narragansetts in the forefront in arguing to have their lands returned, in the forefront of suing the federal government, states governments, in the forefront of finding ways to pursue their rights, in the forefront of these debates about boarding schools and indigenous rights all the way to the Carcieri decision in 2007. So when I think about the ways in which my people have shown up over and over again, they have done this always with an eye towards what it doesn't, not necessarily what it means for the individuals doing it, but what it means for the future. There's one, I'll leave you with this one instance where there's a petition from a Narragansett. This is after detribalization happens in 1880. This is in the 1920s. And one of the Narragansetts, named Daniel Secreter, petitions the federal government and says, hey, how can we be recognized by the federal government? And, you know, our detribalization was illegal, and they've said this when it happened. How can we be recognized? And the federal government writes back and says, well, you don't exist. You can't be recognized by the federal government. But the interesting part of that story is that when Secreter put that petition in, he was in his late 70s, and he had no descendants, no direct descendants. So this petition, he wasn't asking for the land to be returned or how could he be recognized for himself, right? This was about his community and thinking about the future. And that advocacy, right, obstinance, survivance, resistance has been part of the Narragansett experience forever.
Thank you, Bruce. Dr. Bruce, right? Yeah.
Bruce Banner is a doctor.
Bruce Banner. Well, thank you all for your answers to my questions. I think that, I appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience appreciates as well. So much so that they gave me a handful of extra questions for you. So the first question I'm going to ask is, what is due to the peoples of the Eastern Woodlands today? Anyone can answer. Or I'll pick someone. I didn't realize it.
I can start, and then I'll let you guys add on. I think that acknowledgement, to follow up on what Mac was just saying, is due to us. And the struggle for that over all of these years, centuries, has been really, really persistent. And that was one of the things that I was getting at as I tried to map out what had happened in Mashpee over the last 300 years, is just how important that is to us tribally, that we are recognized and acknowledged and our voices are heard. I mean, I didn't really get to tell the whole story of Reuben Connigue. He actually left on that mission to go see the King of England, and he boarded a ship where he was told he was going to be taken to England and that he was going to see the king. And he and others who had boarded with him were immediately enslaved by the ship captain, who was a bit of a pirate, and took him to the West Indies and took him to all these different places that were not exactly the mission that he wanted to go on, but he was persistent. Found another ship captain that would bring him to England, and to just consider that this native man who is being diverted all over the world ultimately finds his way to England, and we're talking in the 18th century, that he finds his way there so that he can express his voice, his people's voice, to the King of England, and actually got a response. That's the kind of persistence that we know even today in Mashpee, and I'm sure I see it in all of you guys, and in these communities. We're not going away. So acknowledge us in a good way. I love that we're having an opportunity to tell our story in our voice. That's so important, because for so many years it was being interpreted by people outside of our tribes. And yeah, I mean, the work that Mac and Kim are doing to make sure that voice continues to be heard, and that people can find it in the library, or they can, but that's really important. That and recovering our land. I mean, I could say that all day long. It's so important that we can recover even small parcels of land. These are our ancestral homelands. Every bit of this land is sacred to us. So getting back these pieces of our land is so critical. And people should be aware. I mean, land acknowledgements, I have a funny feeling about them. I mean, they're nice, but what are you going to do? You're acknowledging that this was our land. Go to the people of that land and work with them to restore the land to them. Then there are agencies. We all know I do work for the Native Land Conservancy. That's one way of being able to restore land to indigenous people, because it's an indigenous-led land conservation organization. But the very first thing you need to do, if you have land that you know needs to go back to its indigenous caregiver, we are the original stewards of this land. You go and you find that tribe that can recover that piece of land, and it will be taken care of. And it will also be important to those people, because that land is also sacred to us. Said enough.
I'll just build really quickly off of what Paula said, because it reminded me of a few things. The acknowledgement and what that portends is extremely important. I teach a community engaged class at the university, and one of my students was writing a reflection, and they wrote how they were talking with one of their friends on campus, and they were talking about how they were going to go down to the Narragansett reservation and kind of, just be in community with Narragansett tribal members. And the friend responded, "There's Narragansett?" I thought that was a beer, right? But this is really, you know, the narrative that exists. So acknowledgement is extremely important because of what it portends. Now, if you realize that the Narragansett are not a beer, right? Well, there is Narragansett beer, right? But that has nothing to do with the Narragansett people. We don't get royalties, all right? But if you realize that these people do exist, then they have to be part of your calculus, right? Like Paula is saying. I wrote an op-ed in the Providence Journal a couple of weeks ago about the preservation of some land in Rhode Island, and there was an article that preceded it, and it was a celebratory article about how the Department of Environmental Management and the Nature Conservancy in Rhode Island had gotten together to preserve this land, and it was titled "The Most Beautiful Part of Rhode Island." For all posterity, everybody gets to go hiking out this place. And in my op-ed, what I said was, if you go hiking at this place and you look at the rocks, you will see that these rocks are discolored. And these rocks are discolored, they look like they're painted because of the millennia of fires that were set at this place. Because this is a sacred place. And because of the lack of acknowledgement, that land preservation effort can be framed as a positive thing when it is a continuance of dispossession. It's a continuance of erasure, that nobody even thought maybe we should give this land back to these people who it's sacred to. No, they celebrated themselves for saving it for everyone except for the people who had stewarded it for millennia.
I think my initial response to that question about what is owed, I was just going to say land back. But I mean, thankfully, both of you unpacked it really well in terms of what that could mean. But I think also it means finding ways to use privilege, think about spheres of influence, spaces where we are comfortable in our lives and where we can step out of that zone of comfort in order to uplift and uplift others who have been oppressed, and like pursue collective liberation in ways that we become not just allies but accomplices, and like getting the work done in the ways that we can make sure that people, that the sort of sovereignty, inherent right of sovereignty, and the right that Mashpee people have to their land and their home place is not questioned. The right that Narragansett people have to access forms of economic development are not questioned, right? Like, what can people do to use their networks and connections to make sure that instead of being people who are like imposing or supporting or complicit in reifying the systems or connecting in some ways, supporting the things that seek to sort of undermine the right of Indigenous people to be on their land and be connected to the land? Like, how are we all working together to make sure that we're not on the wrong side of that, if people are really interested in how they can help? It had me thinking a lot about, as someone who works in Rhode Island, who is a guest every week in Narragansett homelands and in spaces that are connected to Wampanoag and Nipmuc and Narragansett histories. In coastal areas, I think a lot about gentrification. I think a lot about the real interruption of access to these ceremonial places, because there are houses there that are occupied for a couple months a year, right? That people don't have unfettered access to spaces and places that are extremely important and sacred to like how we remember and connect to our lands. And for Nipmuc people, there are, there's as freshwater people. There are lakes and riverbeds and swamps and marshes that are so polluted that we can no longer harvest traditional materials or traditional foods because they would be poisonous to us or they are not growing correctly. And like, what are we all doing to help everyone move toward health for the environment, but also for the ways that we're able to connect to our cultures and our life ways that are so important. And it also had me thinking of this idea about how can we be not racist but actively anti-racist, right? Like, I think you can bring that logic here when we're thinking about how do you just be not complicit by saying nothing, but be actively pushing up against anti-Indigenous policy that is exacted upon Native people in Massachusetts.
Thank you all. So here's a question from the audience. If you could sit down with the governor of Massachusetts or Rhode Island and had full power to decide what would be a genuine process of reparations, what would it look like in recognizing the harms and ongoing impacts of King Philip's War? I already made my request.
All right, I'll go. I think I might want to take this back, but no. I think the thing that jumps to mind really quick is there's one, education, right? So in Rhode Island today, teaching about Indigenous history is not mandated, right? Even after the 2020 social justice movement, when Rhode Island updated their curriculum to include the experiences of peoples of African descent and Pacific Island descent, but not Native peoples, right? And the reason why this is so important is because the children that learn these stories are the ones who are going to make decisions in the future about where resources are allocated and what is important. And if they continue this narrative that Narragansett is only a beer, then obviously those resources and those values are not going to be shined on that community. Very specifically, I would say honor treaties, right? So one of the challenges for all of these communities that are represented up here and all peoples that are what I call first contact communities or they're east of the Mississippi River is that our agreements and treaties were made with now defunct colonial and local authorities, right? And there was no obligation, I guess, for the United States that inherited these relationships to honor those treaties. So we have a treaty from 1709 that reserved, a 64-mile expanse, 41,000 acres, but it's signed by the Queen, right? Queen Elizabeth II, right? And the Narragansett. So, how do we kind of have a process in which, as a nation that inherited these relationships, also have responsibility to honor them?
I would add that if I could get in front of the governor, I would want to remind her of, and this is kind of a treaty or maybe not, but the Mashpee Wampanoag, the Wampanoag people have never given up our hunting and fishing rights in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we fought for that for many, many years. And many of our fishermen and our hunters experienced brutality on the part of law enforcement and having their equipment ripped away from them. And, we had to go to the highest court in the state and fought for that. And it was recognized in the highest court in the state that, yes, indeed, these are people who have these fishing and hunting rights, and they need to be honored and respected. It does happen that in Mashpee, we we get that respect from the Mashpee law enforcement and harbor masters and the like. But once we go outside of Mashpee, it's a different story. There are places that we go, my tribal ID does get me access to the waterway. We should have access to any of the waterways, any of the beaches. We are people of the First Light. This is the place that we go to have ceremony. If any of you are ever up that early, Craig, are you up that early? And you go down to the South Cape Beach, you might find a group of Native people who have a fire going and have a ceremony going. And that's just part of our existence. And it should not be something that we get harassed about or get turned away from. Yeah, I would like that more universally accepted, not just for the Wampanoag, but for all Indigenous people. It's just so, it's an important ceremonial right that we have. It's an important right to hunt and to fish for sustenance for our families. A lot of our families still do that. You know, we have tribal families in Mashpee that still need to hunt and fish to provide for their families, and it's getting harder and harder to live in places like Mashpee, in coastal Rhode Island, and places where the cost of living is just incredibly high. So these are important things to us.
I just want to plus one everything that was said. I think for me, it would very especially be these asks about curriculum and education. I think that's so important. I look back on my education and think about how meaningful it would have been for me as like the only Native kid in my school to understand more about histories that I am a part of. You know, that I didn't see myself reflected in any space where I felt like I was any kind of stakeholder in terms of what I was learning or understanding, or in the ways that I felt seen by the people who were educating me. And that does a lot. And it wasn't until I was an adult and had agency over myself and what I was interested in working in libraries that I really was able to be like, no, actually we're here, and all the things that I know and have connected to in my family and in my household are like, there's more of that I can find in these places, and it's really meaningful. So I think the education component, and also thinking about, the sort of, not just honoring hunting and fishing rights, but like the outreach that can happen at like a municipal level to help people understand that we have these inherent rights. Like even like signage sometimes can help. How people administer like fishing permits or things are really important when you think about food sovereignty and sustainability. But I also wanted to cede my time and ask Cheryl if she could answer this question, because I think as someone who's...
I think, well, I mean,
Yes.
that's what you guys mentioned, treaty rights, understanding that we are sovereign peoples, no matter who recognizes us or not, education, a chance to truly govern ourselves. Right now, we've been, I guess, not really struggling, but going back and forth with the state of Massachusetts about, the tribal government has the same rights as a municipality. We should be treated as such when it comes to funding and things like that. So yeah, we do have a laundry list that we put out there, but I think that mostly the first thing would be education. People need to know that we're here, that we're still here, and that we are a separate culture, a separate government, a people. And we have a responsibility to each other and to the land that is our relative. And we wish to
acknowledge that and be acknowledged for that. But we only have like 8 or 9 minutes left. So I'm going to read one more question from the audience and then one more from the Partnership of Historic Botanists. So this was, Kim spoke about land given to settler colonial soldiers. Can you speak to, or anyone speak to, the people that were given as the spoils of war? We all know that happened.
Well, do you want me to go there with Bermuda? Oh, God. It was so tragic. So many of our people, I think I mentioned as I was speaking that once our people were deemed, a threat, they were either killed or sold into slavery. And one of the places that they ended up going, well, they started sending people after the Pequot War. They started sending people down to the West Indies. There's actually, there was a law passed in the West Indies, I think it was in 1675, that banned bringing any more Indians to the West Indies because they were just making life hell for them down there. They were telling all of the African slaves, hey, listen, we don't have to do this. And uprisings happened. And anyway, so I think that was the impetus for sending slaves to Bermuda. We do know that a great many people were sent after King Philip's War. We believe very strongly that Metacom's wife and son, who were held for a year, his son was probably only about 8 or 9 years old. They were held for a year before the colonists decided, oh, I guess we won't kill them because she's a woman and he's just a little boy. So we're going to let them live. Sent them off to Bermuda. But that's an example of a community. They lived communally there as enslaved people on one end of the islands of Bermuda, and they retained that sense of their cultural awareness, that they were people from here. And we didn't forget them. That's a much longer story than we have 8 minutes for, but that's exactly what the question brought to mind for me.
Really briefly. So there's this passage that is well known for historians. It should probably be well known for people. It's Roger Williams writing and talking about the aftermath of the Pequot War and how he would like to receive a Pequot with a little bit of red upon his neck, right? And this is him saying that he would like, as the spoils of war, this enslaved Pequot boy, who he's going to name Will after himself. One of the things that you should know is that New England or Massachusetts Bay, those colonies are saved economically by the Pequot War, right? And the spoils of war that becomes the enslavement of Native peoples, right? The ship that comes back, I want to say the name is the Desire, but they send it to the Caribbean, and when it comes back, they send it to the Caribbean with enslaved Pequots, and when it comes back with enslaved Africans, there's a Thanksgiving because now there's this economic model in which they'll be able to survive.
Just to connect to some of that too, in thinking about legacy and relationships and memory and maintaining connection and culture. Maybe Paula, you could talk a little bit more about the reconnecting work that has happened. So there's been people across Wampanoag and Pequot and other communities who have found their relatives in Bermuda at St. David's Island, and every other year there's a reconnecting powwow where people go to St. David's Island, and then also people will come here to attend Skamitzen, but also maybe they come to Mashpee, to connect and reconnect and, be together as kin who separated across time and space have found each other.
We call them our cousins 350 years removed. And they come to Mashpee every year.
Thank you. This is our last question. What do you hope people carry with them or do after tonight's conversation?
I would say, really briefly, that the reason why you had to come here to hear these stories and purposefully seek out these narratives is by design, right? They're not part of the narrative for a reason. This is purposeful. And once you know that, and once you recognize that, I think that it's a responsibility for you to make sure that you help to share this information, right? Help to be part of, like Kim was saying, this anti-racist ethos, right? Where you feel incumbent upon yourself to make sure that you're challenging these narratives, not by being silent or just knowing them for yourself, but by actively understanding and trying to tear down the logics that they perpetuate.
Yeah, and what that brought to mind for me too is, this is an adult audience, obviously, and I can't tell who's on Zoom calls, but I understand there's quite a few folks out there. I imagine there's a lot of teachers out there, and that a lot of this begins very early. A lot of the misinformation begins very early. At Smoke Signals, we had the great pleasure and honor to work for a number of years on a project with the Smithsonian to create an installment of something that they have. It's on the website. You all can find it. It's called Native Knowledge 360, NK 360. And one of the curriculum segments on there is called How to Tell a Better Thanksgiving. And I think it's a really important tool for teaching children. It's aimed at school children, I think 3rd to 5th grade. But it's a curriculum guide for teachers of that so critically important age group where children form their understanding of who we are. And I think it goes a long way to educating, a huge population of people. Yeah.
Paula just made me also think about the Reimagine New England Histories curriculum project, which is available online, which does some of this same work about fronting, foregrounding the experiences of Black and Indigenous communities in New England. And it's a curriculum designed for teachers throughout New England based on standards that different states use. So I encourage you, if you are an educator or a student or interested, to search that out also.
That you helped build and design, I think. Don't leave that part out. Yeah, and just again to sort of plus one everything that was said, I think, especially what Mac was saying, like if you've learned something here and you've come here to learn, I think we're all sort of responsible to teach other people or bring them to other things with you and open the minds of other folks. I think the same way I think about, filling my responsibility to my ancestors to set a good path for my child and my grandchildren and future generations to come. I think we can all carry that responsibility together no matter what our background or what community we come from. So if you've learned something here today, I think really important to seek out additional resources, read Native history by Native authors, but also thinking about the season that we're in. There are a lot of upcoming opportunities to engage at social events with people across our communities, right? We have powwows, we have artist fairs and things like that, and I think it's really important to meet people where they are, to not only be reading the history and sharing with people you know, but to also be supporting Native artists and coming to the spaces that Native people welcome the public into, to make those connections and to sort of pursue these forms of like recognition and understanding and inclusion.
And I think Cheryl should answer this question too, because she's our elder. on this.
So what do I hope people carry with them? I mean, truth. I think that we should tell the truth. I mean, I say a lot how the founding of America and what we've taught about the founding of America and how this country came to be afterwards is really just a big marketing campaign, because it didn't really happen the way you learn in the history books. It's just marketing to make you think that something is noble when it wasn't. There was murder, there was death, there was destruction, there was thievery, there was terrible, terrible, terrible things happened. And not just here in this country, of course, the whole world is like that, right? But yeah, I think I want people to think about it and know the truth and learn the truth and carry that truth forward.
I think we can even just more. Thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists. I think, Mac really, and everybody really hit it on the head in some ways, where you can't get a conversation like this. I'm just like really, my head's just exploding with the amount of your experiences and insights you have shared with us. And I think hopefully speaking for everyone, is so incredibly grateful for your time and sharing yourselves that way. So thank you so very, very much for that. And I think and this conversation reminds us that, again, just as you were all saying, that the history often called King Philip's War, right, is not a distant event. It continues to shape land relationships, community memory, ongoing struggles for sovereignty and recognition, as we really heard quite a bit about tonight. I want to thank you all for being here and engaging in this conversation with care and respect, and we're grateful to our moderator and to our panelists and to everyone who joined us tonight, those especially also online, and many, many thanks and appreciation to our hosts here at the Boston Public Library. And before you go, I do want to say something that we really realized in putting this series together, that 8 programs just like scratches the surface. There is so much to be understood about the history, about today, about, and as you were talking about, art and music and literature done by Indigenous people, that you need to be able, that we can all seek out and find. It is out there, and once you start looking, you will really be able to find it. Something somebody told us at the very start of this programming was that a resource that nobody should ignore is each of those official tribal websites. For learning about the history, but also for understanding what are the issues today and how can people support and maybe get to that level of accomplices that Kim talked about as well. We did put a list of those on our website, so you could get there by looking at our resource list and finding the websites of the different tribal nations. I also mentioned, because we said that we're scratching the surface, we do have an upcoming talk in September where one of our former panelists on our first panel, Brad Lopes, as a Quina Wampanoag, is going to be moderating a discussion with a non-Native scholar, Daniel Richter, on Land is Idle, Justifying Land Expropriation. And so a lot of what, again, some of the things that were discussed here tonight about a sort of age of exploration, papal bulls, what were the justifications that English Puritans used to explain their expropriation of native land? And so the combination of, again, of a native and non-native scholar working together to, this will be an online panel. Another program, we do offer also walking tours in Boston, so you might want to check those out. But some of the people that you saw here tonight are coming back for an online program on stolen relations, uncovering untold stories, and that's Lynn Fisher, Cheryl Tony Hawley, Paula Peters, and Loren Spears. And so that's going to be talking about that groundbreaking online digital archive stolen relations project. So am I reminding you that you're going to be part of that? Okay. Oh yeah, that is in, oh wait, it says, what, is it November? No, October, no. October 7th, yes, thank you very much. I'm looking on our website, it actually says it's for today, so we have to change that. Yes, that's October 7th. So those are a few upcoming things. Please visit our website, our social media channels for resources and updates. And again, just thank you all very much for being here this evening.